2nd February 1943, Northern Pocket, Stalingrad. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann lay curled in a frozen basement that smelled of gangrene, urine, and death. Around him, the remnants of his company, once 180 men strong, had been reduced to 11 skeletal figures too weak to stand. Outside, Soviet artillery had finally stopped. The silence was worse than the shelling. It meant the end had come. Klaus's hands, black with frostbite, could no longer grip his rifle. His stomach, empty for 6 days except for a few strips of boiled leather, had stopped cramping. He'd watched his closest friend die 3 nights ago, simply closing his eyes and never opening them again. No wounds, just cold, hunger, and the slow shutdown of a body with nothing left to give. Through the basement's shattered window, Klaus could see Soviet soldiers moving methodically through the ruins, clearing the last pockets of resistance. He thought of his mother in Hamburg, of the letter he'd written 2 months ago, assuring her he'd be home by Christmas. That letter never left Stalingrad. Neither would he. Of the 290,000 German soldiers encircled here in November, Klaus would be among the 91,000 who surrendered, but he would not be among the 6,000 who ever saw Germany again. The question that would haunt historians for decades was simple and terrible. How did 98% of an entire army simply vanish? Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the Second World War. Where are you watching from, and could you have survived what these men endured? To understand how 284,000 men died or disappeared in the frozen wasteland of Stalingrad, we must first understand how they arrived there. Operation Blue, launched on 28 June 1942, represented Hitler's grand strategic vision for defeating the Soviet Union. Capture the Caucasus oil fields while simultaneously seizing Stalingrad, the industrial city on the Volga River that bore Stalin's name. General Friedrich Paulus's 6th Army, 270,000 men, organized into 22 divisions, was the spearhead of Army Group B. These were not conscripts or second-rate formations. They were veterans of Poland, France, and the early victories of Operation Barbarossa. They possessed excellent equipment: Panzer IV tanks with upgraded 75mm guns, Sturmgeschütz III assault guns, MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns capable of 1,200 rounds per minute, and the confidence of soldiers who had watched the Wehrmacht conquer a continent in 3 years. By mid-August, advance elements reached Stalingrad's outskirts. On 23 August 1942, the Luftwaffe unleashed over 600 aircraft in a devastating raid that killed over 40,000 civilians and reduced much of the city to burning rubble. German commanders, viewing the inferno, believed resistance was broken. They anticipated occupying the ruins within days. Instead, they encountered General Vasily Chuikov's 62nd Army, which had transformed the bombed city into a 3-dimensional killing ground. Chuikov's strategy was radical: hug the Germans close, fight at such intimate range that German artillery and air superiority became useless. Every ruined building became a fortress. Every pile of rubble concealed firing positions. They called it Rottenkrieg, rat warfare, where soldiers fought floor by floor, room by room, sometimes for control of a single staircase. The battle devolved into savage close-quarters combat. The central railway station changed hands 15 times in a single day on 14 September 1942. Sergeant Yakov Pavlov's garrison held a single 4-story apartment building for 58 days against repeated German assaults. More Germans died trying to capture that building than died taking Paris. By early November, German casualties exceeded 50,000 killed or wounded, yet the city still had not fallen.
Meanwhile, hundreds of miles to the north and south, a catastrophe was brewing that German intelligence either failed to detect or failed to adequately report to Hitler. Soviet High Command, under General Georgy Zhukov's operational planning, had identified the fatal weakness in Germany's Stalingrad salient. The long flanks stretching along the Don River were held not by German troops, but by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian armies, poorly equipped satellite forces lacking adequate anti-tank weapons. Throughout October and November, the Soviets assembled over 1 million troops, 13,500 guns, 894 tanks, and 1,115 aircraft north and south of Stalingrad. Units moved only at night. Radio silence was rigidly enforced. By mid-November, Operation Uranus was ready, a massive double envelopment designed to cut off and destroy the entire Sixth Army. At 0730 hours on 19 November 1942, over 3,500 Soviet guns erupted along the northern flank. The barrage lasted 80 minutes, a wall of steel that obliterated Romanian defensive positions. Then came hundreds of T-34 tanks surging through fog and snow. The Romanian Third Army collapsed within hours. The next day, the southern pincer struck with equal fury. On 23 November, Soviet forces met near Kalach on the Don. The ring closed. Inside the pocket, 290,000 men, the entire Sixth Army plus supporting units, completely encircled as winter set in. The trap that would consume nearly 98% of them had sprung shut. The moment of encirclement on 23 November presented General Paulus with the most critical decision of his military career and Adolf Hitler with a choice that would define the battle's outcome. Paulus immediately requested permission to break out westward. His staff officers calculated they had perhaps 72 hours to force an escape corridor before Soviet forces consolidated their positions. Every hour of delay meant more Soviet reinforcements, more anti-tank ditches, more minefields. A fighting breakout would be costly but feasible. The Sixth Army, though exhausted from months of urban warfare, still possessed significant combat power, operational tanks, artillery, and approximately 250,000 effective soldiers. Abandoning heavy equipment and wounded who couldn't travel, perhaps 150,000 to 200,000 men could be saved. It would mean losing Stalingrad, the symbolic prize Hitler had fixated on for months, but it would preserve an army. Hitler's response came swiftly. Hold at Stalingrad. Form hedgehog defense. Supplies will be delivered by air. Do not retreat under any circumstances. This decision, refusing to authorize the breakout, sealed the fate of 290,000 men. It was based on two catastrophic miscalculations. First, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, desperate to maintain Hitler's favor and addicted to morphine by this point, assured the Führer that the Luftwaffe could supply the pocket by air. He cited the successful airlift to Demyansk earlier in 1942, ignoring that Demyansk involved far fewer troops over shorter distances in better weather. The mathematics of the airlift were simple and unforgiving. The Sixth Army required 750 tons of supplies daily: food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, winter clothing, just to survive as a fighting force. Göring promised 500 tons daily, but even this was a fantasy. The primary transport aircraft, the Junkers Ju-52, was a slow, lumbering tri-motor from the 1930s. The pocket had only makeshift airstrips that deteriorated rapidly under heavy use and winter weather. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft artillery controlled the airspace. Blizzards grounded entire squadrons for days. The airlift never delivered more than 300 tons in a single day, less than half the minimum requirement. Most days saw far less.
Transport crews displayed extraordinary courage, flying through storms and heavy fire, but courage could not overcome logistical impossibility. U-52s were shot down in droves, wounded couldn't be evacuated, supplies dwindled, and the men began to starve. By early December, rations had been cut to 200 grams of bread per day, supplemented by watery soup. Horses were slaughtered and eaten, supply horses first, then artillery horses, finally officers' personal mounts. When the horses were gone, soldiers boiled leather belts and harnesses to extract minimal nutrition. Men began dying not from Soviet bullets, but from simple starvation. One soldier wrote in his diary on 8th December, "We are told relief is coming. We are told to hold on, but we are starving. Johann died yesterday, not from wounds, but from hunger and cold. His body is still in the corner because we lack strength to carry it outside. How many more days can we survive like this?" A relief operation, Operation Winter Storm, launched on 12th December under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, offered brief hope. His 4th Panzer Army drove northeast through brutal Soviet resistance. By 19th December, advance units had closed to within 35 miles of the pocket perimeter. German soldiers inside could hear the distant rumble of artillery and dared to believe rescue was possible. Paulus requested permission to launch Operation Thunderclap, a breakout toward the relief force. Combined operations could save 200,000 men, but it required abandoning Stalingrad immediately. Hitler refused. The Sixth Army would hold. Relief would come to them. Maintain positions. The moment passed. Soviet counteroffensives threatened Manstein's flanks. Winter Storm collapsed. The relief force retreated. By Christmas Day 1942, hope died in the Stalingrad pocket. The window for survival had closed. Now there was only suffering. The German pocket, the Kessel, as soldiers called it, became a frozen purgatory where men died as much from cold, hunger, and disease as from Soviet attacks. January 1943 brought temperatures plunging to minus 30 degrees Celsius and below. German soldiers, the majority still lacking adequate winter clothing because promised supplies never arrived, suffered mass frostbite casualties. Entire companies became combat ineffective, not from enemy action, but from cold injury. Fingers and toes blackened with frostbite. One German doctor wrote in his diary, "I performed 11 amputations today without anesthesia because we have no morphine left. The men screamed, but what else could I do? If I leave the gangrenous tissue, they die from infection. If I amputate, they might survive. Probably they will die anyway from weakness. I am no longer a physician. I am a witness to mass death." Disease spread through the pocket like wildfire. Dysentery ravaged men weakened by malnutrition. Typhus, carried by lice that infested every uniform, appeared in late December and spread through overcrowded bunkers where men huddled for warmth. Without adequate medical supplies, treatment was impossible. Wounded lay in frozen cellars converted to aid stations, their groans gradually falling silent as they died from shock, hypothermia, or infection. Food became an obsession that dominated every waking thought. Men spoke constantly of meals they'd eaten before the war, of their mother's cooking, of restaurant dinners, of anything except the reality that they were slowly starving to death. When soldiers died, and dozens died daily from starvation alone, their comrades searched the bodies for any scrap of food that might have been hoarded. One soldier's letter, found on his frozen body, read, "Dear Mother, I have not eaten real food in 3 weeks. We found a dead horse yesterday, and 20 men fought over the frozen meat. I got a small piece. It was the best thing I have tasted in months. I dream of your potato soup every night. I dream of bread with real butter. I dream of being warm.
Mostly I dream of home, but I do not think I will see it again. Please do not hate me for giving up hope. I have tried to hold on, but I am so tired, so cold, so hungry. Forgive me. Soviet forces launched Operation Ring on 10th January 1943, a systematic operation designed to compress and destroy the pocket in segments. Artillery barrages of unimaginable intensity preceded each assault. Soviet infantry and tanks advanced through blizzards against defenders too weak to offer effective resistance. German soldiers, many weighing less than 50 kilograms after weeks of starvation, could barely lift their weapons. The pocket shrank daily. Pitomnik Airfield, the last major landing strip, fell on 16th January, eliminating almost all airlift capability. Wounded could no longer be evacuated. They lay in freezing cellars, their final letters home unsent because there was no way to send them. On 22nd January, Soviet forces split the pocket in two, isolating the southern group containing Paulus's headquarters from the northern group. Each sector now fought its own desperate battle. Communication between pockets ceased. Each believed the other might already be destroyed. On 30th January 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal in a cynical gesture meant to encourage suicide. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. But Paulus, emaciated and lice-ridden, refused to die for symbolism. On 31st January, Soviet troops stormed his headquarters in the basement of the Univermag department store. Paulus surrendered the southern pocket. The northern group, under General Karl Strecker, fought until 2nd February before laying down arms. Of 290,000 men encircled in November, approximately 91,000 marched into Soviet captivity. Most were barely alive. The 91,000 German soldiers who surrendered in late January and early February 1943 were not the combat-ready troops who had entered Stalingrad 5 months earlier. They were walking skeletons, emaciated, frostbitten, lice-ridden, and sick. Most weighed less than 50 kilograms. Many could not walk without assistance. Medical examinations revealed that virtually all suffered from malnutrition, frostbite, dysentery, typhus, or combinations thereof. Soviet authorities were unprepared for the sheer number of prisoners and their catastrophic condition. The Soviet Union itself was struggling with food shortages and recovering from devastating losses. Prison camps hastily established around Stalingrad and in more distant locations lacked adequate shelter, food, or medical facilities. The death rate among prisoners in the first weeks of captivity was horrific. Men who had survived months of starvation and cold simply could not recover. Their bodies, pushed beyond endurance, shut down when liberation came. They died from the shock of warmth after prolonged exposure. They died because digestive systems ravaged by starvation could not process food. They died from typhus and dysentery that had weakened them beyond recovery.
One Soviet officer overseeing a prisoner collection point later recalled, "They looked like walking corpses, hollow eyes, skeletal faces. Many died simply sitting down to rest and never getting up again. We tried to feed them, but their bodies could not accept food. They would eat and then die hours later from the shock to their systems. In the first week, hundreds died each day despite our efforts." The march to prison camps claimed thousands more. Prisoners were force-marched through snow and bitter cold to railway stations and collection points. Those who fell behind were often shot or left to freeze. The winter of 1943 showed no mercy to men already at the edge of death. Prison camp conditions varied but were generally brutal. Camps lacked adequate shelter. Prisoners were housed in unheated barracks, tents, or even open fields surrounded by barbed wire. Food consisted of minimal rations, thin soup, small amounts of bread, occasionally fish. For men already starving, it was insufficient for recovery. The death toll continued mounting through 1943 and into 1944. Disease remained the primary killer. Typhus epidemics swept through camps, killing hundreds. Dysentery was ubiquitous. Tuberculosis spread rapidly in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. Gangrene from untreated frostbite claimed limbs and lives. Medical care was minimal to non-existent. Soviet medical resources were prioritized for their own forces and civilians. But beyond disease and starvation, prisoners faced forced labor. Those healthy enough to work were sent to construction sites, mines, and factories throughout the Soviet Union. They built railways, worked in coal mines, cleared rubble, cut timber, back-breaking labor for men already weakened by malnutrition and disease. The work quotas were often impossible to meet, and failure meant reduced rations, creating a death spiral where weakness led to reduced food, led to greater weakness. One German prisoner who survived later wrote, "Of the 150 men in my barracks in early 1943, only 12 were alive by the end of the year. They died of disease, starvation, exhaustion from forced labor, or simply the accumulated toll of suffering. We buried them in unmarked graves, hundreds at a time. I survived because I was a skilled carpenter and worked in camp maintenance rather than in the mines. But even so, I weighed 45 kilograms when I was finally repatriated in 1955, 12 years after capture." The mortality statistics from Soviet camps are disputed by historians, but the most reliable estimates suggest that approximately 85,000 of the 91,000 Stalingrad prisoners died in Soviet captivity. Most died within the first year. By 1950, only about 6,000 remained alive. These survivors were gradually repatriated to Germany, the last group returning in 1955, a full 12 years after the battle ended. The final arithmetic was devastating. 290,000 men encircled in November 1942. Approximately 91,000 survived to surrender. Of those, only 6,000 ever returned to Germany alive. That means 284,000 men, 98% of the original force, died either in the pocket or in Soviet captivity. An entire army had simply vanished. The question that haunts Stalingrad's history is not just how 284,000 men died, but how and where they died. The breakdown reveals the multiple stages of death that consumed the Sixth Army.
Deaths in the pocket. November 1942 to February 1943, approximately 150,000 to 180,000 men. These soldiers died during the encirclement from combat, starvation, disease, and exposure. Combat casualties accounted for perhaps 60,000 to 80,000, killed in action during the defensive battles or in failed breakout attempts. But the majority died from non-combat causes. Starvation claimed tens of thousands, men who simply grew too weak to function and died in their sleep or collapsed while on duty. Frostbite complications killed thousands more, gangrenous limbs, hypothermia, or the simple shutdown of bodies that could no longer maintain core temperature. Disease, typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, ravaged men weakened by hunger and cold. One statistical analysis noted that in January 1943 alone, the Sixth Army was losing approximately 1,500 men per day inside the pocket, with only about one-third of those deaths resulting from combat. The rest died from starvation, cold, and disease. Bodies were left where they fell, because survivors lacked the strength to bury them properly. Deaths during surrender and initial captivity, February-March 1943, approximately 15,000 to 20,000 men. These men survived the battle only to die within days or weeks of capture. Their bodies, pushed beyond recovery during the encirclement, simply shut down when the fighting ended. They died during the march to collection points, in overcrowded holding areas, or in the first days of imprisonment. Soviet authorities were overwhelmed by the number and condition of prisoners, and thousands died before any systematic care could be provided. Deaths in Soviet captivity, 1943 to 1955, approximately 85,000 to 90,000 men. The majority of the 91,000 who surrendered died in Soviet prison camps over the next 12 years. Most died in 1943, perhaps 50,000 to 60,000 in that first year alone, from disease, continued starvation, and complications from injuries sustained during the battle. Typhus epidemics were particularly deadly. Forced labor claimed additional thousands, especially among those sent to mines and construction sites in harsh climates. By 1945, when the war ended, perhaps 20,000 to 25,000 Stalingrad prisoners remained alive. These survivors continued dying through the late 1940s and early 1950s from accumulated health damage and poor camp conditions. The 6,000 survivors, why did they live? The approximately 6,000 who eventually returned to Germany were survivors through a combination of luck, skills, and circumstances. Many were specialists, doctors, engineers, skilled craftsmen, whose expertise made them valuable enough to receive slightly better treatment. Some were captured earlier in the battle before extreme starvation had set in. Others simply possessed robust constitutions that somehow withstood conditions that killed their comrades. Luck played an enormous role, avoiding typhus, being assigned to less brutal labor details, being in camps with slightly better conditions. One survivor later reflected, "I do not know why I lived when so many others died. I was no stronger, no more determined. I think it was simply luck, random chance that I avoided the diseases that killed thousands, that I was assigned to work details I could physically accomplish, that my body somehow retained just enough resilience to survive. But I carried tremendous guilt. Why me? Why not Johann, who had a wife and 3 children? Why not Stefan, who was a better man than I? There was no reason, no justice in who lived and who died." Beyond statistics, the 284,000 who never returned each had a name, a story, and people who mourned them. German military records and personal archives preserve fragments of these lost lives.
Gefreiter Hans Müller, 24th Panzer Division. Captured on 31st January 1943. Died in a prisoner camp near Krasnogorsk on 8th March 1943 from typhus. His final letter to his parents, written in December before mail service ceased, was never delivered. It was found by Soviet soldiers searching the Univermag basement and eventually archived. In it, he wrote about hoping to see his childhood home in Bavaria again, about missing his sister's wedding, about wondering if his family still remembered him. His parents received an official missing in action notice in April 1943. They waited decades for news, dying in the 1970s, never knowing his fate. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann, 389th Infantry Division, the soldier from our opening scene. Captured on 2nd February 1943 in the Northern Pocket. Died on a forced march to a railway collection point on 6th February 1943 from exhaustion and exposure. Buried in an unmarked mass grave outside Stalingrad with approximately 200 other prisoners. His mother received his last letter in October 1942, written before the encirclement. She never learned what happened to him,
dying in 1962, still hoping he might somehow return. Feldwebel Otto Schmidt, 71st Infantry Division, surrendered on 31st January 1943. Survived initial captivity and was sent to a labor camp in the Ural Mountains in summer 1943. Worked in a coal mine. Died in December 1944 from pneumonia and exhaustion, weighing approximately 35 kilograms at death. His wife in Berlin received an official notification that he was missing in action. She remarried in 1951, assuming he was dead, but always wondered if he might have survived. Lieutenant Friedrich Weber, 6th Army Headquarters. Captured with General Paulus on 31st January 1943. Survived until 1949 in various prison camps. Died in a camp in Kazakhstan from tuberculosis just 6 years before the last repatriations began. His family received confirmation of his death only in 1957 from returning prisoners who had known him. Gefreiter Ernst Koch, 76th Infantry Division, one of the approximately 6,000 survivors. Captured on 2nd February 1943, weighing 48 kilograms. Survived initial captivity due to skills as a mechanic, assigned to maintain camp equipment. Repatriated to West Germany in 1949. Spent rest of his life suffering from health complications related to malnutrition and trauma. Rarely spoke about Stalingrad. Died in 1983. These individual stories, multiplied by 290,000, represent the human reality behind the statistics. Each man who vanished at Stalingrad left behind family, friends, and futures that would never be realized. The destruction of the Sixth Army had profound impacts beyond the immediate military disaster. For German families, the loss of 290,000 sons, husbands, brothers, and fathers created a void that shaped an entire generation. The official casualty notifications, when they came, often listed men as missing in action rather than confirmed dead, leaving families in agonizing uncertainty for years or decades. German authorities, for propaganda reasons, initially concealed the magnitude of the disaster. When the battle ended in February 1943, Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels declared 3 days of national mourning, but claimed the Sixth Army had fought to the last man rather than surrendered. The truth that 91,000 had surrendered was concealed from the public. Families were told their loved ones had died heroically rather than that they might be alive in Soviet captivity. This deception had cruel consequences. Families mourned men who were actually still alive in prison camps. When survivors began returning in the late 1940s and 1950s, some discovered their wives had remarried, believing them dead. Their children didn't remember them, and their places in society had been filled by others. The psychological impact on survivors was profound. Those who returned carried trauma that often proved impossible to process. Survivor's guilt, "Why did I live when my comrades died?" haunted many. Physical health was often permanently damaged. Chronic digestive problems from prolonged starvation, cardiovascular issues from exposure and malnutrition, missing limbs from frostbite amputations, and respiratory problems from disease and harsh labor. One survivor wrote in 1960, "I returned from Stalingrad in 1955, but part of me never left. I see the faces of friends who died. I hear their voices. I dream of the cold, the hunger, the desperation. My family welcomed me home, but I was a stranger to them and they to me. I had lived through something they could never understand, and I could not find words to explain it. Stalingrad did not end for me when the battle ended. It has never ended. Historians estimate that many of the 6,000 survivors died prematurely in subsequent decades from health complications directly traceable to Stalingrad. The true death toll, measured across lifespans cut short, may exceed even the immediate 284,000. In that frozen basement on 2 February 1943, when Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann watched Soviet soldiers approaching and knew his war was over, he was experiencing the final moments of Germany's greatest military disaster. Of the 290,000 German soldiers encircled at Stalingrad in November 1942, he would be among the 91,000 who surrendered. But he would not be among the 6,000 who eventually saw Germany again. The 98% who never returned, 284,000 men who simply vanished into death, represent more than a military statistic. They represent a catastrophe born from strategic hubris, ideological obsession, and the refusal to acknowledge reality until far too late. They died because Hitler prioritized symbolism over strategy, because Goering promised logistical miracles that could never be delivered, because commanders were forbidden to make rational decisions that might have saved lives. The soldiers who died at Stalingrad, whether in the ruins, in the surrender, or in Soviet camps, deserved better than to be sacrificed for a city that had ceased to have strategic value, in service of a regime that saw them as expendable. Their suffering was immense, their deaths often prolonged and miserable, and their memory deserves to be honored by acknowledging the truth. They were victims not just of Soviet military prowess, but of German strategic delusion.
Only 6,000 of 290,000 survived. That single statistic encapsulates the horror of Stalingrad more than any description of battle could. An entire army, one of Germany's finest, reduced to 2% survivors. The remaining 98% vanished into frozen earth, unmarked graves, and the vast expanse of Soviet prison camps, leaving behind families who mourned, questions that lingered for decades, and a lesson about the terrible cost of hubris in modern warfare. On that February day when Klaus Hartmann's war ended in a frozen Stalingrad basement, he joined 91,000 other German soldiers in surrender. But his story, like that of 85,000 others who surrendered with him, would end not in repatriation, but in death far from home. Only 6,000, just 2% of those encircled, would ever see Germany again. The question, how did only 6,000 of 290,000 survive, has a complex answer. They died in waves, in the pocket from starvation and cold, during surrender from accumulated trauma, and over 12 years in Soviet camps from disease and forced labor. But the ultimate answer is simpler. They died because strategic decisions made hundreds of miles away prioritized ideology over human life. Stalingrad was where an entire German army vanished, not in a single dramatic moment, but through months of suffering that consumed 284,000 lives. The 6,000 who survived carried the memory of the 98,000 who did not, bearing witness to one of history's most complete military catastrophes and one of humanity's most terrible examples of the cost of war, fought without regard for those who must do the fighting and the dying. But while Germany's fortunes collapsed in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, Allied forces were preparing operations that would open new fronts and accelerate the Third Reich's defeat. Join us next time as we uncover the story of Operation Husky the Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943, where American, British, and Canadian forces launched the largest amphibious assault before D-Day and began the campaign that would drive up through Italy toward the heart of Axis Europe.